So welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Migrant Solidarity on Trial, New Research and Civic Space Impacts in Europe. I'm Michelle Lavoie. I'm the director of PICUM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, which is organized by PICUM. And I'd like to say a special thanks to all the speakers for accepting our invitation to share their insights today. This webinar will be held in English and Italian, so there's interpretation in Italian. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. And in case you might have any technical difficulties, please contact Jalal or Mafalda from PICUM. We'll be putting the emails in the chat in case you need any assistance. We'll also foresee a Q&A session at the end of the panel, so you can put any questions you might have in the chat or in the Q&A function. We also have a code of conduct at PICUM when we have events, whether they're online or in person, that we would like to make sure that it remains a respectful and safe place for everyone. So in terms of what we would expect participants at our events to do is to treat others with dignity, courtesy, and respect, listen actively, give space to others, respect people's privacy and personal boundaries, use inclusive and non-discriminatory language, ask for consent before screenshots or quoting someone, and to please follow the guidance of moderators and facilitators. And we also have an email in case you do encourage, in case you actually experience a violation of this code of conduct. The email is safe@picum.org. So we're very pleased to have a record number of people who are registered, almost 170 people, which really reflects the ongoing relevance of these issues, particularly at a time when civil society is increasingly under attack. Migration is treated primarily as a matter of national security and criminal law. And as we speak, less than 2 hours ago, the members of the European Parliament voted in plenary on the return regulation. The overwhelming majority, 418 MEPs, voted for this regulation. 218 voted against and 30 abstained. Why we are mentioning this in particular is that many of you who might be attending have probably followed this regulation. For those who haven't, there is a possibility in this regulation for EU member states to conduct raids in people's homes and, quote, any relevant location, unquote, in order to deport migrants. So it's easy to imagine what the consequences could be for organizations and people acting in solidarity now that this will become law. And I think we'll hear a little bit more on this regulation when Sylvia Carta from PICUM also takes the floor later. As PICUM, we've been working on this issue of criminalization of solidarity for 25 years, but since 2018, we've been monitoring the cases annually as PICUM and also part of a previous project called Rhizoma. So today's webinar marks the launch of our report that explores the latest trends in the criminalization of solidarity across Europe and what this means for civic space and the rule of law. And we'll put a link in the chat to that report. So this year, we're very grateful actually to have the opportunity to do this annual monitoring of cases as part of the WIN project, which is a transnational initiative which responds to the growing criminalization of solidarity and the shrinking of civic spaces across Europe. And we're very glad that the coordinator of WIN, Guia Gilardoni, who is the project coordinator, is here with us today and who'll be on the panel. We also wanted to make a short kind of disclaimer about what's covered in the report. So the report includes a number of cases of people who were criminalized even when they were migrating and acting in solidarity with fellow travelers, and they were faced with prosecution for facilitating their arrivals. But the report does not cover in depth the full extent of the criminalization of migrants, where we see every year that there are hundreds of people who attempt to reach Europe and who are unfairly accused of smuggling. So, for example, sometimes because they are simply touching a boat's wheel or switching on GPS or simply being present in a vehicle or vessel crossing an EU border. The severity and the breadth of criminalization of migrants is being documented by organizations working on the ground, and we're very happy to host today some activists and researchers who are working in Greece and Italy. So very much welcome Spiros Skalinos and Richard Broad, who will tell more about this dimension of the phenomenon. And finally, we also want to stress that criminalization trends in the area of migration are closely connected to broader civic space trends, including the institutionalization of attacks against civil society organizations. Attacks against migrants, people, and NGOs working in solidarity can be seen as a litmus test for the state of civic space and the rule of law. And we'll hear more about this from Arti Narse from the European Civic Forum. So this discussion is not only an opportunity to present evidence of how criminalization trends play out, but also to really underline the role of civil society in exposing them, especially as national and EU policies continue to push for more restrictive and punitive measures. So now I would very much like to welcome our panelists and kick off our discussion and warmly invite Guia Gilardoni from WIN Project Coordinator. Guia, can you give us a brief introduction of the WIN project itself and explain why transnational initiatives are essential for coordinated responses to the criminalization of solidarity across different national contexts? Please feel free.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, PICUM, for organizing the webinar and for all who make the time available. This is a very important opportunity to learn one another. So the WIN project is namely empowering actors in civic space protection. And we lead as ISMU Foundation, we have PICUM, but also the consortium is composed by partners from Hungary, Poland, Greece, Italy, and France. So WIN starts from the assumption that attacks on solidarity and civic participation and human rights activism are symptoms of a wider democratic backsliding and authoritarian tendencies we are seeing across Europe. And the project therefore combines the monitoring of criminalization cases with other activities, co-creation of responses, transnational cooperation, policy dialogue, public awareness activities, and with the broader aim of protecting civic space and strengthening those who defend fundamental rights. So within WIN, we start from the key assumption that PICUM has articulated for many years. The criminalization of solidarity is an integral component of the wider criminalization of migration. And we see embedded in each national context with its own political, legal, and historical specificities. The criminalization process often begins in the same way. It begins with the instrumental use of language and the construction of hostile narratives that allows to portray certain forms of civic engagement as problematic, dangerous, or even illegitimate. So, through these narratives, solidarity actors are gradually transformed into potential threats to public order, national security, even social cohesion. It is important to recognize that the logic is similar across context. So, and from it, and it is from this discursive shift that are created the condition for the introduction of laws, administrative measures, and policing practices that make the criminalization of solidarity both politically acceptable and practically feasible. Back in the 2018, we really couldn't imagine that after years we were in the situation we are now. In this sense, criminalization is part of a broader repertoire of measures to which civic space is progressively restricted. What is particularly striking is that this repressive logic does not only travel from one country to another, but also across different issue areas. So we see the same mechanism used to target those supporting migrants deployed against other civic actors, including, for instance, environmental defenders, human rights advocates, and social movements, pointing to a common pattern of democratic erosion across different policy fields. For this reason, it's not only transnational initiatives, but also intersectoral approaches are essential. And this is what we're trying to do with this project. So if patterns of repression are increasingly shared across countries and sectors, responses cannot remain confined within national borders or thematic areas. So building transnational and intersectoral connections allows civil society actors to recognize common challenges, exchange experiences, learn from one another, and develop collective strategies to cope with the criminalization. So in practical terms, this means creating opportunities for human rights defenders, activists, and civil society organizations operating in different contexts to share knowledge, to share legal tools, to share advocacy practices and forms of mutual support. And I conclude by saying that empowering this actor is not only a way to respond to specific cases of criminalization, but it is also a way to defend the fundamental democratic principles of freedom of expression, civic participation, and the value of solidarity itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guia, for that excellent framing that I think really helps many of us who are working on these issues to also see contextually how this transforms. How I think what you've shown with the most simple thing is how it starts with language itself. And then you move from language to narratives, and then you move from narratives to policies. And when you're in the policy area, how do you respond? And so I think you really, in this, you really talked about this intersectoral approach and really how do we use these as ways to then really ensure that we're defending democracy. So I think you've really given us in the space of a couple minutes a lot of things to reflect on. So thank you for that and for also kicking us off for this discussion with the wing framing overall. Thank you for that. So I'd like to now go to Sylvia, PICUM Advocacy Officer, who I would ask to present a little bit the report looking at criminalization of solidarity with the migrants in 2025. So Sylvia, what are the key trends that are emerging and what are the patterns that stand out as particularly alarming or new compared to previous years? Please feel free.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks, Guia, also for introducing the webinar. So indeed, today we're going to present the findings of our 2025 report on the criminalization of solidarity with migrants. And again, it's a special report exactly because this year we've got support from partners in several countries, from France to Hungary, from Italy to Poland. We actually got additional organizations working with us to help us monitor the media, but also other sources to strengthen and complement our work. And for those who are familiar with PICUM, you will know that this is not our first report, but this is an exercise that we conduct every year since 2022, and it actually has started in the early 2000s when PICUM was also born, and we published the first book of solidarity, so the first broad report that talked about the criminalization of solidarity with undocumented migrants. So we really see that this is not at all a new trend, and we are trying, of course, to do our best to monitor and to share this data, but there is so much to do, and not only, of course, in the field of solidarity, however that's defined, but also in the broader field of criminalization of migration, as today's vote on the deportation regulation, I think, has told us, but also as we'll hear from the colleagues speaking after me, who will present some very important cases and information from Greece and Italy. But moving to our report, something which is very dear to us is the methodology, and I think it's also very important to share it with you to introduce the content, because of course monitoring criminalization of solidarity is not a simple exercise in the sense that it's not a phenomenon which is first of all easy to define, but also easy to measure. So we try to actually cross-reference different sources and to find, first of all, the cases also across the media, across civil society reports, across the monitoring of judicial activity. And this year we were also able to do more interviews, to have some organizations that actually collected some testimonies from other civic space actors working in the area of migration that were themselves criminalized. However, I have to also, let's say, speak of the limitations in the sense that many cases might just not be reported or detected by the media, and that's our number one source when it comes to information. Or, of course, they're just not reported by the people experiencing criminalization due to fear of backlash, but also simply speaking, because they may not have the tools and the resources to kind of escalate and to share information outside of their specific national context. So all the numbers and informations that I'm going to share are to be considered really as minimum numbers. This is really a conservative estimation of a phenomenon which is way broader. And we hope that with all the presentations during this webinar, we will give you at least a better picture. If not, of course, it will not be a complete one, but at least it can give us really a measure of the importance and the urgency of also addressing criminalization in all of its forms. But maybe moving to the content of our 2025 report. Last year, we were able to cover 10 countries. So Greece, Italy, Poland, France, Spain, Latvia, Malta, Slovenia, Hungary, and Cyprus. We focus on the European Union, and I'm definitely not saying that in the other 17 there were no forms of criminalization, but again, we were not able to track them for one reason or another. And we identified three broad types of criminalization. So judicial prosecution, where there were 110 individuals who faced judicial proceedings for acting in solidarity with migrants in various forms. Then administrative sanctions that were imposed to at least 11 NGOs and other entities, and then 33 cases of non-judicial harassment. And I really want to bring your attention to these last two figures, so 11 and 33, because they are really symbolic. They're really low as compared to what we actually estimate the phenomenon to be. But these are also the most difficult forms of criminalization to track, especially when we talk about informal and non-judicial harassment. First of all, because it's really something that may or may not be reported. It may also be highly sensitive and political issues for organizations experiencing it. But I will talk about it more in detail later. So let's say that the most complete group of people that we were able to cover in the report is those that face judicial proceedings, and that's it's very easy to understand why, because we have the court's documents, we have a lot of information on these cases, and we can really go back to tracking the information about the story, what happened, how the case developed. And this year we actually found 99 cases of people that were criminalized for what we defined as humanitarian actions. So, for example, rescuing people in distress, engaging in civil disobedience actions, such as, for example, protests, providing legal aid, information or shelter, and much more. And then we also wanted to spotlight 11 cases that actually saw people being criminalized for providing services to migrants, meaning just for doing their jobs. And they were 2 taxi drivers, doctors, psychologists, and interpreters who were actually criminalized in the context of providing, services or help to people who were migrants, but doing so in their professional capacity. And we think this is a very important development and trend to also follow, because of course we don't consider, even if we call it solidarity, any form of work with people who are migrants should be protected. And it's also very interesting. I mean, every year we have a lot of cases. We have a lot of people brought to trials, but we consistently have a finding of that most of them are acquitted. So they're freed from all charges once the trials actually end. And this year we had 41 out of 110 cases that were open that ended. And most of them, so 38, was with a full acquittal. So the charges were completely dismissed. And only in 3 cases, people were convicted, but with a suspended sentence. 2 of them were actually taxi drivers who transported someone across a border from Spain to France, and they just didn't know that that their passengers were undocumented. And the third one was actually a very famous criminalization case, the mayor of the Italian small town of Riace, Mimmo Lucano, who faced a very, very long judicial ordeal that lasted more than 10 years. And eventually, out of a broad, let's say, accusation structure that included very serious accusations, was only convicted for a minor offense. And then out of this big number, we also have 69 cases that are still ongoing, as we are always counting the cases that are open in a certain year rather than just the new cases. Because, of course, a very important element is also the length of judicial proceedings. So people really facing trials that go from a couple of years to peaks of 7 or 10 years, and that really also impact them personally, but also, let's say, professionally and financially. Moving to the administrative sanctions, I think that all the Italians in the room will, of course, recognize the examples, because we are mainly talking about all the sanctions to the search and rescue NGOs imposed by the Italian government. We see very high and impactful fines. We see the detention of search and rescue vessels, and basically policies that since several years have tried to deter their action in the Mediterranean. There are also a couple of other cases of organizations, especially in France and Greece, that have actually been targeted because of their political activities and refused accreditation as civil society organizations recognized by the government. And finally, when we talk about non-judicial harassment, we have 33 cases, some against individuals, some against civil society organizations, and they are of very different nature. I think Guia portrayed it very well. So from attacks that are purely, let's say, for example, attacks in the media, but of course, attacks that were actually from political actors, politicians, government members, for example, to other types of threats, which are maybe more subtle. So, for example, administrative audits, withdrawal of state funding, and other sanctions mainly due to criticism to public and official policies. And then there are also a lot of cases which are linked to police stops, harassment, seizure of phones, deletions of video recording, and so on and so forth. So also physical intimidation as well as verbal intimidation. And just to give you some examples, I mean, I just picked 3 case studies from the report, but there are really a lot of them. We see for the first time, for example, the staff of a search and rescue NGO being brought to trial. There had been previous instances in Italy, but cases always stayed at the investigative stage, whereas now we also see people really going to trial after a search and rescue operation. In France, I put the example of the organization that was denied state accreditation after having a positive evaluation because they raised concerns about the deportation of one of their community members. And finally, also some very serious harassment that Greek NGOs have received for challenging the Greek government suspension of asylum procedures that was recently introduced in Greece. Just one more minute, maybe I will skip this slide because I think the findings were quite clear already from the rest of the presentation. But I wanted to just say a few words about the EU developments, because we have 2 very important files that are being discussed, and one, of course, has just been voted. The Facilitation Directive, which is actually the instrument that allows for this criminalisation to happen due to a very ambiguous definition of what constitutes an humanitarian or selfless action, and that is actually being reformed, but it's currently blocked. And even in the framework of this reform, we risk seeing something that will continue cementing the status quo rather than challenging it. And I'm also happy to elaborate in the Q&A. And then secondly, this return regulation, which we see as a real risk for civil society. I just included one example, which is the extension of powers for migration authorities to actually conduct raids, not only in private homes, but also other relevant locations to enforce deportations. And we really see how this could be used to deter not only the action of civil society, but also of individual people acting in solidarity. Let's imagine all of those that are actually hosting someone who does not have documents at their place to avoid them sleeping on the streets. And these measures could actually be used in this direction. And we really hope that we won't see actual cases coming up in our next reports, but unfortunately, this is not a reassuring trend. But with this, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any other question in the Q&A. And of course, I also recommend you to take a look at the report, because you will find way more detailed cases and information there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that very extensive and in-depth presentation. I think also just to add one comment on your last slide when you were showing kind of the EU level developments, also we have some of the national level developments. Belgium has adopted a law allowing home raids in essentially a very similar way as the EU now regulation on return. And also Sweden just this week also adopted law requiring service professionals in certain government agencies to also report undocumented migrants when they're coming actually to get professional help or guidance in different areas. So I think we see, unfortunately, these trends at the EU level also reflecting some of the national level developments as well. But I think you've also highlighted kind of some of the areas, even in as an organization, kind of collecting these cases on an annual basis, even where we see, as you highlighted in one of your slides earlier, where some of the lower numbers are probably never, like these numbers that even we have as PICUM are never the true extent of what's going on. But even within the numbers themselves, some of them are also hard to track. So the admin cases and the non-judicial harassment. So I'm sure we will hear more as we continue on in the panel and also in the Q&A. So please feel free, if you do have questions to any of the panelists, please feel free to write them in the Q&A or in the chat. So now I'd like to turn to Spiros Galinos, who's the Community Peacemaker Team's representative of the Aegean Migrant Solidarity Organization. So Spiros, together with the Border Violence Monitoring Network, you have conducted monitoring of trials against migrants accused of smuggling. Could you walk us through your main findings and what specific concerns you might have identified regarding fair trial standards in these proceedings? Please feel free and welcome.
Hello, Michelle. Thank you for the invitation and hosting us. I will share now my PowerPoint so we can start. I will skip the introduction, so we take advantage of the time to focus more on the findings of our research last year and the concerns that have been raised. Only a few words about how the research was conducted. It was a collaboration between the two organizations, Community Peacemaker Teams and Aegean Migrant Solidarity, and the Border Violence Monitoring Network, which we together conducted a research on the courts of the maritime, on the courts of the islands of Greece, of the crossing points in Greece. And that includes 5 islands. That includes Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Rhodos, and Creta. What we actually wanted to examine it was a systemic trend that we have recognized over the past years, where migrants, in clear case also of transportation, they have been prosecuted as smugglers and with the regulation, with the legislation in Greece being quite strict about it, facing quite large sentences, both imprisonment but also fines. A political rhetoric is being built around that. It's not only what migrants have to face, it's not only on practical terms, but all this thing has also a great performative role to play. Because on the one hand, migrants are being portrayed as a threat that has to be dealt also, but also the Greek government can come back to portray themselves as somebody that they take care and protect the borders of Greece. Migrants being portrayed as part of a hybrid war, it is one of the main narratives that we have to face in Greece. And this has serious implications for migrants themselves as well. Because it's not only the time that they will have to spend in prison or the prosecution and the harassment they will face, but for all of the cases that migrants are being prosecuted as smugglers, then this has serious implications into their asylum applications. The research took place between January and October 25, and we managed to follow 123 cases that concerning 190 defendants. Just to understand the extent of what is happening in Greece, we need to understand that at this right moment in the Greek prisons, we have more than 2,500 people that they are being detained or imprisoned after trial for smuggling charges. This is the second largest population in the Greek prisons. So you understand that it's quite concerning. Most of the trials that we monitored, it was for people that they were had as the main charge was for illegal transportation of third country nationals that they didn't have the right to enter Greece. In most of the cases that we see that we are talking about young males from specific regions as well. But what was clearly recognized by our observers in the trials was that we are talking for cases in the majority, the great majority of the cases, we are talking about people that they were in need of self-transporting themselves or survival. Pre-trial detention, I will pass now to the main findings, and we will have more time to speak about the different aspects in the Q&A session. But some of our main worries that we examine them also under the provisions of the Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights was that we saw that pre-trial detention was widely used. 159 out of the 173 defendants that we were able to examine their case were detained before trial. There were no alternatives provided for people to not being detained before the trial. Barriers to effective legal defense. In most of the cases, the people prosecuted, they don't have either the means, either the knowledge how to seek legal defense. So they will have to rely into state-appointed lawyers that also they're being appointed the same day of the trial. So you can all understand what implication this has to their adequate defense. Other main issues, the interpretation. Interpretation not only during the trial, but the translation of critical documents for the people to understand what they are being accused for and what are also the decisions many times coming out from the trials they have been put in. We haven't seen in a single case the translation of the indictment of the prosecution. And of course, we haven't even seen, not even in a single case, the translation of the decision of the trial. So people have to rely on the advices given by their lawyers, on what it has been communicated to them by various actors in their support and defense. The times of the trials. From the 123 cases that followed, half of them, 50% of them, lasted under 30 minutes. And we are pointing this out because if we come to compare, to correlate the time that the trial has lasted to the sentences that are being imposed to these people, it's something tragic. We've got people that they have been sentenced to more than 300 and 400 years imprisonment in a trial that lasted under 20 minutes. And this is important because we can all understand that in a trial lasting so little, you cannot properly examine the evidence, have a proper process. The prosecutor witnesses, in most of the times, they are absent from the courts. This is something also that has been regularized by the Greek government by allowing, if the witnesses are state officers, they are not obliged anymore to be present in the court. Only if there is a specific demand by the people prosecuted or their defense lawyers, which we understand, especially in the case of migrants themselves, they don't even have any idea about this right to ask for the witnesses to be there. And 25 out of the 29 prosecution witnesses that were present, they were all state officers. They were all, most of the cases, Hellenic Coast Guard officers, the ones that they apprehended the boats. Where were the witnesses? Where were their co-passengers of the boat? The prosecution never seeks for them. It seems that their testimony has not the same credit with the testimonies of the state officers. In parallel to that, we can understand how difficult it is for these people to present witnesses in their defense. There are people that they are isolated, marginalized in the Greek prisons with usually no means to come in contact with their families and loved ones. So they don't have the means either to seek from members of their families or people that they would be very useful in presenting their case, but also to seek for other witnesses from the boat that they would support their case. Over the last year, we have seen the increased use of plea deals. It is a new measure that has been introduced in the Greek courts over the last few years. Maybe some Greek colleagues could elaborate to that. With the main concern raised about it is that because the implications coming out of a plea deal like that for the migrants are always never being communicated to them. They don't know what they are signing when they are going into a plea deal. They don't know that they don't have the right to appeal. They don't know that after a plea deal, they won't be able to file an asylum application. And as we understand, with the profiling of these cases, the convictions are massive. We have seen sentences that they reach over 550 years. The largest one that we witnessed was 570 years. However, this has to do also with the Greek court system and the judicial system. We can see cumulative sentences like that. In the Greek prison system, the higher that somebody can be sentenced, served time in prison is 25 years. So, and to that conviction, we have seen over 50% of the cases, young men that they will have to serve the next 25 years into the Greek prisons that we should remind everyone for the convictions that they exist from the European Court of Human Rights about the conditions in them, conditions that people couldn't bear. Together with them, but together with the sentences of imprisonment, we've got also some high fines being imposed to these people. Ridiculous fines that no one would be able to pay, fines that they are there only to have a performative role, a performative law for the law and order that the Greek governments want to promote over the years. we are pretty aware how the convictions are being made. In most of the times, you get into the courtroom and you're feeling that you're watching another bad movie on a repeat. You know the decisions beforehand. You know that the prosecutor and the judges themselves have decided for the outcome of the case before they even examine the evidence in court and the defendant themselves. That's why we can see some very high proportions of the prosecution and judges aligned to the decisions and the sentence imposed. And you understand that I don't think I have to elaborate more on the presence on this basic this basic human right of the defendants, this basic per trial standard about everybody when they enter the room, they should be presumed as innocent. Something like that is not happening in Greece, it's not happening elsewhere in Europe. The defendants are being profiled and their lives come to support the basic racist and marginalized narratives of the EU and the national governments. Certain recommendations can arise from the findings, like the provision of a proper legal aid, the use of alternatives rather than pre-trial detention, about the importance of the interpretation in the trials, but also of the court documents, and also the examination of the evidence in the courtrooms. I will try to conclude it here, and I will be available for any more questions you may have at the end during the Q&A session. Thank you very much, and sorry if I had to brief everything so we stay within time. Thank you very much. Back to you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you so much, Spiros. That's a really impressive focus that you have within your report and your findings, and just looking at all of those slides, it seems like an extremely bleak and dire perspective and questioning of the rule of law. Does it still really exist with all the evidence that you're showing there? And then I think your recommendations linking specifically to the evidence that you see on the ground of where this is being challenged. So these are really important for us for the discussion. Thank you for sharing this. And once again, hopefully we can go a little bit in depth if people have some more further questions in the Q&A. So I'd like to now invite Richard Broad from Archie Porco Rosso to share a little bit, Richard, about your report From Sea to Prison, which tracks cases of people who are prosecuted for smuggling in Italy while also capturing broader criminalization trends. Richard, if you could share what are the most significant developments that you might have observed in 2025, and did anything stand out in particular?
Hi, sorry, I just had to close the door. So this is our update. So we now do annual updates on our figures and our information. I'm Richard, and I'm part of Archie Porco Rosso, and we work together with Borderline Europe, who I'm sure is an organization many of you know. And a lot of our work based in Palermo is about direct support to people and people on the move of all sorts of different kinds, people with their working documents and legal strategies of lots of different kinds, in which criminalisation is a large part of that. So that means that I'd say kind of more than half of our work is direct support. I think that's the same also for the community peacemakers. And then each year we try to monitor what's going on using very similar methods, as Sylvia explained so well for the PICUM report, of media monitoring, cross-checking that with lawyers and activists, people on the ground, and trying to cross over those different sources of data. We have the advantage that the Italian press is terrible in protecting people's privacy, which means they publish a lot of information about arrests that they make, which is very useful for us from a monitoring point of view. And sometimes it means we can also get in touch with lawyers and criminalized persons themselves because of the information being published in the online press. I'll give the same proviso as Sylvia gave in terms of our data collection, which is it's incredibly imprecise. It's not scientific. It's based on the bias of news articles and the information we managed to gather. And I think some of you were present when we had a meeting. We talked about some of these issues some months ago, and I have a few updates as well on our data since we published it in January or February, and which also again shows the difficulties in gathering this data. So I will, if I can share my screen, which I think I can. Can I do that, or do you need to share my screen?
I think it should be that thing at the bottom that says share. If you can try that, maybe.
There it is.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so let's share this screen. Share that. Good. So that's our Italian website. And now can you see the English one? Is that good? Can you see that? Yes, From Sea to Prison annual report?
Yes,
Great.
yes.
Okay, so I'll just go. So this is our update that we published at the end of February, beginning of March, which is based on our media monitoring alongside some other cases for the 12 months of 2025. And as with the peacemakers, we focus on the criminalisation of people on the move. It says the criminalisation of migrant boat drivers, but as will become clear, that is actually not the only people who we are focusing on. So I'll just roll down. I'll just start on this graph because I think this pie chart shows what we usually look at, which is the people who are arrested as boat drivers. They're arrested for holding the compass or driving boats, or making a phone call, and they're arrested immediately after landing. So these are people that we have managed to see from our different sources who are non-Europeans arrested immediately after arrival by sea. And we can categorize those people generally, we could say boat drivers, though it might be people doing different activities. And again, just reading through the news articles and some other sentences or court documents shared with us by the lawyers that we work with, we can see that just under half of the people who are arrested are from Egypt, many from North Africa, many from Bangladesh, and then going around some from the Middle East, Sudan, East Africa, and then a group of people that we don't know the nationalities of. And that's very similar to trends that we've seen over recent years. So people arriving by boat from Egypt and Libya, generally the people who are arrested as driving those boats are Egyptian nationals, or if they're leaving from Tunisia, generally North African. But then we also have people arriving from across the Ionian Sea and the Adriatic Sea, and we've seen an increasing number of people from a whole range of countries. It used to be more Ukraine and Russia and Central Europe, and now it's very disparate, the people who are being arrested on that route. So we counted 97 people who are arrested immediately after arriving by boat last year. A slight update is that I can share this with you as well. See if I can share this with you, if I'm any good at this. I'm not very good at this. No, because this thing is in the way. There we go. So we have the Italian police new data came out in April, and they say, and if I can see, I can find it, yes, for the Italians, but I will translate it. They say, and I'll just highlight it here, that last year, over 2025, they made 375 restrictive orders for trafficanti, which can be translated either as smugglers or traffickers, which is a political problem and also a problem for understanding what's going on at all. So for, let's say, smugglers and people facilitating immigration, and also for people who are trafficking human beings, and also for boat drivers. So it's a big number. And then they break that down to more or less half and half between their word for boat drivers, which is scafisti, which could mean all sorts of things. It could also just mean smugglers. And then another half for people who are criminalized for illegal immigration and human trafficking. Now, I'm sure lots of people know what I'm going to say here, which is all of those words can mean all sorts of different things, which means their data, the official police data, doesn't really give us a very good picture of what's going on and who's being criminalized. So what we tried to do over the past few years, and I'll go back up, down here, over the last few years, is while doing our media monitoring, we tried to broaden our look at who's being criminalized for what in Italy is Article 12 of the Immigration Act, that is for facilitating illegal immigration. And the idea was to look at a bit of everything that's going on, not just people crossing by sea. And so with the graph that I'm showing you here, we can see that around a fifth of people, this is again just from media monitoring, who are arrested arrive by sea. 16% people arriving by land, that's generally people on the northeastern Italian border, so coming through the Balkan route. Then 12% of people who've been targeted in anti-mafia operations, so that's Italy's kind of anti-mafia police investigating complex smuggling operations. A very small percentage for people involved in work exploitation in the agricultural sector, and then about a third of cases, the biggest amount, for what we've called here work quota visa corruption. What we mean is it's the investigations into Italy's official method of allowing in generally manual and service sector workers from outside of Europe through work visas. And there's been, over the past couple of years, a huge campaign by the government to investigate corruption in those entrances. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen if I can manage to. Again, I don't know how to stop sharing. Don't know if someone else can do that. No.
Maybe just click on it again. I don't know.
Click on it again. No. Stop share. There we go. Great. So I want to say why we've been doing this and why we think this is important. And thank you very much, Spiros, for going through everything that you said about the trials and the problems in the trials, which I'd say 90% are things that we see as well. The number of people in prison in Italy for these cases is less. It's about half of the number of people in Greece, which, of course, given the population of Greece and Italy and the prison population overall, is disastrous for Greece, but it's not great for Italy either. And there's the big difference that in Italy, there is legal aid for these cases, which also makes supporting people much easier. And so my solidarity with you and your colleagues for supporting people in such difficult circumstances. The reason that we've been trying to look at this is because we are very aware that the criminalization of people on the move as for facilitating illegal immigration is, as well as being an attack on democratic freedoms, is a white supremacist method of keeping non-Europeans out of Europe. That's the premise. That's the point. Looked at from that point of view, if someone is wrongly accused of being a people smuggler or rightly accused of being a people smuggler, makes very little difference, because politically it's the same operation. Accusing people who have done nothing of people smuggling just widens the injustice. But the fundamental point, the reason from our point of view that Italy and Europe pursues these laws and prosecutes these people is a part of Fortress Europe. That means that if we look at our figures from last year, and we can see around 100 people were arrested as boat drivers, but around 500 people were prosecuted for somehow allowing people into Italy, the phenomenon becomes even more serious. That can be aside from any questions of defense, because we know within those 500 people, there are also police officers, accountants, lawyers who have been accused of facilitating illegal immigration because they were paid to do so, right? Because they were corrupt. But what we see is this broadening of these investigations as a method of keeping numbers down and kicking people out of Italy. So I think it's and I'll wrap up here, but I think it's an important thing we need to keep our eye on as activists, both in terms of combating Fortress Europe, but also defending democratic freedoms, is to follow these other cases closely, even ones that we may be less sympathetic to in many ways as activists, and maybe prosecutions of people who we don't want to demonstrate full solidarity with. But I think it can show tendencies within how these laws are being used and their final aims, which we need to follow very carefully.
Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing those that analysis, but also some of the evidence that you've collected as well in your research on the ground. I think that you've highlighted precisely kind of what bigger forces and racism is at stake here. You know, just 2 hours ago, when the European Parliament was voting on the new return regulation, there were chants from the far right in the room of send them back, or, you know, like this type of language that's even visible, obviously, at the highest levels at the EU. So I think it's nowhere clearer than the evidence that we see, even that all of you are bringing from the ground. So thank you for making those links for us. And I'd like to now also remind you, if you have any questions, we'll come to them after our last speaker here. Please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. And I'd like to ask Arti Narsi from the European Civic Forum to share with us your thoughts, Arti, because you follow civic space developments closely at the EU level. How do the findings of this criminalisation of solidarity and migrants that we're hearing from the report, from the various reports here, how does all of this connect to the wider picture on the rule of law and civic space in Europe? And please feel free. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's great to hear the speakers' interventions and the rich research that is happening on this very important issue. So yeah, I would like to kind of zoom out and bring the picture back to what is happening at the EU level, drawing on some of the findings that we have made from our annual civic space report, which just came out last month. So the first thing to say is that the issue of criminalization of solidarity is part of a bigger picture of a very serious deterioration of civic space, which we are witnessing across Europe. And it's just to be clear, it's not just in, you know, some countries. I know usually countries like Hungary and Poland are mentioned, but really in countries where, you know, well, countries that have been thought to be protectors of democratic freedom, such as Denmark, Finland, France, Spain, Italy, where there's quite serious deteriorations taking place, as well as Germany. And these rights are not just being, you know, ad hoc restricted. They are actively being restricted by anti-rights actors, political forces, and governments that are seeking to reshape the agenda, to silence debate, and to exclude and discriminate against particular groups of people. So those who are at the intersections, as you mentioned, migrants, religious and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI rights, women, environmental defenders, and those who are essentially expressing disagreeing opinions towards their governments. So our very clear finding in our 2026 report to bring to this discussion is that there is a very clear trend emerging where EU policies and rhetorics are reinforcing attacks on civil society across the continent. And as ECF, we've been calling this the new Brussels effect. So while traditionally the idea of the impact of Brussels has always been positive in terms of protecting democracy and rule of law, what we see about this new Brussels effect is that it's really taking on a much more darker and negative meaning and impacting on civic freedoms. And this unfolds in particular ways in an interplay. So we see that legislative proposals and political priorities that are emerging from the EU institutions are contributing to restricting civic space and have direct repercussions at national level. At the same time, of course, national developments are feeding back into EU policy debates and policy making. And as a result, we see a two-way dynamic, which is reinforcing and normalizing practices that undermine the role of civil society. And of course, as was highlighted by many of the speakers, this is visible in the migration policies, which criminalize solidarity and stigmatize civil society. It's seen in our the funding attacks that are taking place at EU level against public advocacy, And it's also seen in the proposal of foreign agents laws, which we've seen happening quite increasingly across Europe. So I want to touch on these three elements because, of course, our report findings are quite wide. We have 8 key findings, but to zoom in on these three in terms of the the fringe smear campaigns and the institutionalized harassment against NGOs. At the European Parliament, we are seeing attempts via the scrutiny working group into NGO funding, which was formed last year under the Budgetary Control Committee, where MEPs, particularly from the far right, together with some EPP MEPs, who have used this hearing to attack the legitimacy of civil society's public interest advocacy and have questioned civil society's role in participation and influencing policymaking. And just one example of hearings in February this year where some MEPs used the opportunity to question Muslim-led organizations who are being accused of being close to terrorist organizations, to quote, and they've accused migration organizations of facilitating illegal migration. So what we are seeing here is, as you've pointed to in the opening, these are not just narratives, they are unfounded accusations and they contribute to a feedback loop. And what they do is that institutional scrutiny here is actually legitimizing politically motivated reputational attacks on civil society. And this is having serious consequences. So as I said, there's an interplay occurring. So what's happening at EU level is also taking place in parallel at national level, where in a number of member states, Austria, Germany, France, to name a few, most recently in France, they've established a fact-finding mission to look into the funding of associations that are working with migrants. So this interplay is occurring and it's having a real impact both at EU level and at national level. As I mentioned, the second area where we're seeing this interplay is with foreign agents laws. I won't go into too much detail with this, but just to say that we've seen a number of member states proposing FARA laws, or Foreign Agents Registrations Acts. And also this goes again with this negative rhetoric, which we see which has quite a delegitimizing impact, but also has a huge role in shaping public discourse around how civil society is seen. And there's risk of this being legitimized at EU level because in 2023, the Commission proposed a Defense of Democracy package, which included a directive which was looking at interest representation services and activities on behalf of third countries, which is de facto a foreign funding directive. It is not as bad as a FARA law, but it has the elements and the makings to stigmatize civil society that is foreign funded. So again, we are seeing how this proposal has been legitimized at national level, where governments are relying on it to propose their own FARA laws. And then coming thirdly to the criminalization of solidarity, which of course has been discussed at length. But just to say, as was mentioned, the returns regulation just being voted today, we are seeing that EU policies are contributing and are legitimizing this criminalization of solidarity and migration, which has become a structural trend across Europe. So we're seeing it in policies, in practice, in institutional framework, and it's being implemented consistently. And this is essentially producing a mutually reinforcing pattern. So it's becoming entrenched in line with member states' harsh approaches towards migration. And then, of course, the EU policies are giving the green light for this and are being used as a political and a legal cover to further stigmatize civil society at national level, but also at EU level. And then finally, just to say that I think this is also taking place, as I said, our report has 8 findings. And I cannot go without mentioning the criminalization of the right to protest and peaceful assembly, which in our data shows overwhelmingly that governments across the EU are normalizing repressive laws and practices to criminalize peaceful protest movements. It's a sustained trend. We've seen restrictive laws being proposed in at least 7 member states. We've seen the excessive use of force being documented in at least 10 member states, with particular groups such as the Palestine Solidarity Climate Justice Group and other social justice movements really being impacted. And this signals to a bigger concern is that, of course, civic space is shrinking, but the space for a public space for people to mobilize, to come together, to march, to hold their governments to account, is becoming smaller and smaller and more restrictive. We also see in parallel to that a crackdown on associative spaces where people form communities to mobilize, to discuss, to just come together to deal with the situation of this world that we are in. And it's very concerning that these spaces are also being cracked down on. So in closing, I just want to say that I think that the fact that civic space is deteriorating, I don't think this is new information to the people who are attending this webinar. But I think it's very important for us to pay attention to this new Brussels effect, because what it risks doing is that these restrictions, as you mentioned, are becoming institutionalized and mainstreamed across Europe. And as ECF, what we have been advocating for is a more proactive and early intervention from EU institutions, from the Commission, because we feel that at the moment, the intervention towards civic space deterioration has often come quite too late, where we see that civil society has been seriously hampered. And of course, there's many things we can learn from the situation in Hungary, but many other EU member states where we are really past the period of early warning signs of shrinking civic space. So I will stop there and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arti. It's really impressive to listen to how you've portrayed all of this because of the work of your organization and really looking at the European Civic Forum and looking at kind of the bigger picture issues and how, in a sense, what we're talking about today, in this webinar on criminalization of solidarity is actually a pattern that we see in so many other areas. So I think that also shows how much it's important for us to be connected as advocates, as researchers, etc. But then also how we see, in a sense, similar tactics. And I think what you also showed at the end of your presentation is it's not just kind of the singling out of these different thematic groups, wherever the thematic areas, but it's also the public space. So even the public space where you kind of connect is also shrinking. So I think really important points that you've articulated also, in a sense, as a way to show a little bit more in depth how Guia was also framing it at the beginning. So I think that's been really important. I do have a little bit of time now for some questions, and I do have one already for Spiros that I'd like to ask, and then maybe to the panel in general, I'll ask you some more general ones. But Spiros, there's a question from someone who is asking if you could briefly address agricultural prisons in Greece, who has heard about people who might be arrested for smuggling work in these prisons to reduce their prison sentences. If you might be able to say anything briefly about that.
Yes, just to clarify, as far as it goes for the agricultural prisons in Greece, if I'm not wrong, we've got 4 of them, and they can detain up to 1,000 people from the 11,500 prisoners at the moment. To get to the agricultural prisons, obviously, it's not open for everyone. You have to fulfill certain criteria, which I wouldn't say that they are so accurate for everyone. But getting to the point of the question, there are certain provisions in the Greek prison system for people to reduce their sentence. First of all, it is the legislation itself that says that from the total of your sentence, you will have to serve, depending on situation, from 2 to 3/5 to the 3/5 of your initial sentence. To this, it will be also co-counted some works and services that you will provide as prisoners in the prisons, not only the agricultural ones, but in the whole prison system. People are working in the laundries, in the kitchens, providing different works and services. Always we should remember as unpaid work to manage to pay to buy out some days of freedom. Yes, so I hope Lotta answered your question, but for more specific, we can always get directly in touch.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Spiros. Thank you for that. We also have a question maybe for Sylvia, but anyone else in the panel, if you'd like to comment, please feel free. So the question is concerning judicial criminalization. What type of offenses were taken into consideration? Was it facilitating smuggling offenses, or were there other criminal offenses which could reach people helping migrants? So, for example, resistance to a police officer, financial offenses. Perhaps in Italy, the criminalization might take indirect and more insidious paths. Sylvia, would you like to come in?
Of course, no, indeed, we keep track of a lot of different types of offenses. Of course, much depends also from the national context and legislation. I'd say that, and what we have in the report is that smuggling or facilitation of irregular migration are used in most of the cases, around 60%, but they're often combined with other offenses, or there are other standalone offenses that are used, and they can also be very serious ones. Those that we find the most would be, for example, participation in a criminal organization, use of false documents or forgery, fraud, acts of terrorism. So really a lot of different ways to frame these actions. And then we also see indeed more creative ones being used by government. This year, I think we had a couple of cases about someone being too close to railway tracks or making a false alarm call. And of course, when we look at administrative criminalization, we also see smaller infractions that are also contested to people just for the, of course, sake of criminalizing their actions. So you can also find this in the report itself. We have a small paragraph where we cover the offenses that we find. In most of the cases, we always we try at least when we can to start from the story, and then we try to dig and understand how the action itself was criminalized. And I think the most interesting is indeed to see what was the concrete action that the person was actually doing in that moment. And very often it's really very basic, either humanitarian led, but also again other activities such as driving a taxi that are then attached to very, very serious offenses. And I think this is something you can see in the report and that we also find always extremely striking, especially because the offenses are then never found as never stand in court. And here, maybe one last thing to say that this is really something we, again, this year weren't able to cover more extensively the criminalization of people who were themselves migrating and criminalized in the process. But this is a striking difference because, as we heard from Spiros in particular, we see that EU citizens or organizations who are criminalized have also more, even though of course trials are long and very difficult. Of course, the treatment is very, very different. We see, for example, detention, like prison detention being used in way less cases. There are, of course, other measures that are sometimes applied, but in the cases of migrants, it is really systematic. So I want to really underline this difference as well when it comes to the kind of areas we have been able to cover and, let's say, the breadth of the phenomenon in reality.
Yes, thank you for that. I think indeed what is also striking when you look at some of the charges is anyone who doesn't work on any of these issues would think it's whatever the person has done is a common sense approach. So basically you're providing shelter or you're providing assistance or you're near a railroad track or, these things are. So I think that's what's also very challenging. And I think what's also interesting, getting back to what you were presenting on earlier, Sylvia, in terms of the legislative framework, is that indeed all of this stems from the 2002 Facilitation Directive. So we should be aware that what is new about this is the intensity, is the really focus, is the increase of cases, the inflamed rhetorics. But the legal framework for this has been in place since 2002. So it's important for us to also see how this evolves. You know, why is it so much more of an issue now than it was at that point? And that's what's really important for us to be connected, to hear from each other, hear from the evidence that all of our organizations are bringing from the ground, and also seeing the bigger picture. So before we close, maybe just kind of one last question to all of you, just for reflection. Or do you want to come in, Sylvia, and then go ahead?
Sorry, I just want to take the opportunity, since I don't see for now any questions from the audience, to maybe also clarify one thing on the facilitation directives revision, because even in that context, we see a big difference between people who are potentially criminalized for actions that can be seen as humanitarian or selfless, and people who might be criminalized, again, for their own entry in the territory or for facilitating someone else's entry or stay in the territory and who are themselves migrants. Because even in the possible compromises that would see a better definition that does not target actions that have, again, a humanitarian kind of objective, there is still a very high risk that the actions that are linked to crossing borders could be actually still criminalized. So I think this will be definitely a challenge and something we have to keep as part of the debate. We must keep looking at, because that's also an issue with the legislative process, wherever it might go in the future, since at the moment we still don't have a sense of the possible developments in the coming months.
Indeed, thank you for pointing that out. And I think when you look at the slides that Spiros was presenting, Richard's website, and you look to see how severe those punishments are for people who are accused of smuggling, obviously the severity of a punishment also for people who are accused of acting in solidarity is very heavy, and it's a huge impact on their lives and people surrounding them. But the ones for the people who are accused of smuggling are severe. I think, Spiros, your slides are very, very telling. It's very, very worrying what's going on. So indeed, I think we have to see what's the legislative process will bring, and most likely it will not. It will cement, as you had said earlier, Sylvia, what's already existing, and probably make it worse. So maybe just some final reflections from each of you. It's a very difficult context that we're all working in. And, you know, you're doing monitoring, you're doing human rights work, awareness raising, advocacy, EU level legislation, national level. What kind of support, including financial, do organizations like ours need to continue to work in this climate? And how do we also see this current context, you know, in doing advocacy work? How are organizations adapting? So maybe just some final reflections that we can all kind of take away for ourselves and for those listening. How should we go forward on this? Like, what do we think we all need to do more or focus more on? So maybe just, I don't know who might want to start for any final reflections.
I can go maybe.
Go ahead, Arti.
So I think this is a very crucial question, and I think this is a question that those of us working in the space need to keep asking ourselves in a very critical way, because, you know, as you see, the institutional landscape, the political landscape has changed so drastically since the European elections. We have more collaboration between far-right parties and the EPP in the parliament, which means that the space for institutional engagement and dialogue is becoming increasingly constrained. So from our side, I think what we have been trying to do, at least, is, and I think this is something that was pointed to in the beginning, talking about, you know, this transnational solidarity, is that we cannot tackle civic space deterioration in a fragmented way anymore. We need to treat, for example, the criminalization of solidarity as an integral component and aspect to shrinking of civic space. It cannot be, you know, a side issue, a thematic issue, just like the issue facing, you know, anti-racism organizations and the attacks that they have been facing and ongoing. This can also not be treated as a thematic issue. So I think we need broader cross collaboration. We need broader solidarity, and at least from our side as an organization, what we have been trying to do is really build a solidarity network, so that all of us working on these different issues who have the same goal of, tackling shrinking civic space and violations against fundamental rights, to tackle it in a much more concrete and concise way, rather than, all of us doing separate things. Because as you said, we have limited resources. We know that the situation on the ground is much more difficult for our members. So we really need to think through how we can support each other and not duplicate efforts, and really try to concisely do things. And just one other last point, I think, on advocacy is that we've also had a lot of rethinking of how we do advocacy, because we realized that, sending a letter is no longer working. So thinking more along creative campaigning and much more alternative ways of building public pressure. We've seen the use of petitions, the ECI campaigns, for example. I think we need to also brainstorm on this to think further beyond just writing letters to institutions and speaking to some MEPs, because it's not proving to be very efficient in this political context.
Thank you, Arti. I think those are excellent points and really help us to think forward, and also to see how you've been thinking about it internally as well, how your network is also trying to build a stronger network. I had Guia and then Richard.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I've learned a lot. And as a reaction from what I've been hearing is, I think it's very important to have a broad understanding of the phenomenon. And listening to you, what came up to my mind is the Saskia Sassen concept of expulsions, which bring us to the understanding of how structural is what we are assisting, because it's the mechanism of expulsion. It's a need of the system, of the political system and of the economic system. And if we understand the criminalization that we are assisting, as well as all the necropolitics, those letting them die, or must imprison these people, it is there's a common ground on the base of the expulsion of this superfluous humanity, to quote Mbembe, which is to some extent useless for the economic system. We need some producer, we need some consumers, but definitely we are too many. And these forms that we are assisting, that we are monitoring, and we should also be able to monitoring more diachronically and from a structural point of view. Only if we fully understand the structural nature of what is in place, we might be able to cope somehow, of course, being well connected and work together, because what is at stake, it's quite big. Thank you.
Thank you, Guia, for that, for really helping us to also have the framework that we can try to understand all of this, and for the good book suggestion. Turn it over to Richard and then Spiros.
Just to say, first of all, thank you for organizing this, PICUM, and also for the report, which I've started to go through, and I'll share with our networks. I was also looking, Arti, at the European Civic Forum report, and I really like the line you have there of, I think New Brussels effect is a very good phrase. And I think, and you highlight at the end there that there is also a pattern of holding the line. And I think in response to the question of what we need to do, I think holding the line is important. Also, in terms of the different timescales between policy and social movements. And there are two examples that I think are important to remember. One is now from a few years ago, which is when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, how borders suddenly melted away in terms of facilitating the movement of many Ukrainian citizens, not all, throughout Europe and across borders, and helping people facilitate immigration because there was the political will. All of those people could have been criminalized, the legislation was there in every country to do it. It's just that there was no will to apply it. So even when we have these whirlwinds of legislation getting worse and worse, I think it's good for us to bear in mind that where there's the will from above or from below, all of that can just melt away and be suspended. And I think we saw that to some extent, not enough, but to some extent we saw that over the past couple of years in terms of Palestine and the solidarity that has been shown with Palestinians and with people expressing solidarity with Palestine, where there have been many, many instances of prosecution not happening, of people being found innocent in the courts. And again, looking towards the facilitation directive, which we're so worried about and what its effects will be, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that this is a European Parliament that was created over the last 5-10 years of politics. And if we want to see in the next 5 or 10 years these laws be suspended or rewritten, then we need to just keep building that movement on the ground that means that things can just melt away in the future.
Thank you, Richard. Excellent words for all of us as we continue to move forward. Spiros, did you want to come in briefly?
Yes, but I wouldn't like to repeat what all the co-panelists have already said, because I think I couldn't add many more things. Just two things that came to my head, as we were discussing this. That for us, that we have been struggling or working through whatever opposition we were all these years around migration. We have been seeing, these things have been developing for decades, and we were always talking for some states, some emergency states, a state of exception that was coming for some time. But I think we can clearly go back to some of the analytical tools that they have been developed the last 20 years and understand that this state of exception, this emergency state, has become the norm, become the European norm. And about approaching how we should approach also the criminalization of solidarity. I totally agree with her that it's not a thematic issue. It's not something that concerns us. The attack on human rights defenders, the attack on the movement, is a way to further isolate and marginalize the targeted populations. And this state of totalitarianism that we are facing today, Richard, I think he done very well to bring the example also of the solidarity in Palestine, how we saw it developed throughout Europe the last 2 years, and how the solidarity movement was targeted and criminalized for expressing their solidarity in Palestinian people. It's something very important to understand the whole concept. And just by wrapping up, coming from something that you mentioned, Michelle, as I was close my presentation, wondering about where is the rule of law. I think we are, at least I will take this as a personal quote. I don't want to point out the organization, but I'm questioning many years if the law is there to support justice, if the law is there to support the narratives of Fortress Europe, the narratives of reclusion and discrimination. So I think we have to go way back to understand what's the legislation, what's this legal system, what its aims and main objectives are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for everything, for the whole hosting.
Thank you, Spiros, and that's my job now to thank all of you. So thank you for being part of this panel, all of you, Arti, Sylvia, Spiros, Richard, Guia. Thanks, Guia, for the WIN project coordination, Sylvia, Jalal, Mafalda, Gianluca from the PICUM team, but especially to all of our interpreters. Thank you as well for making sure that we can speak and be understood in whatever language we're using. I think hopefully this webinar has really shown and given many examples of where are the challenges, how we have to continue to bear witness to them, to monitor monitor them, to report on them, to challenge them. But hopefully it's also shown how much we need to be connected. We really look forward to remaining connected, to showing how we can be strong together as we go forward. So thank you, all of you, and we look forward to continuing together.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.